Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field-forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, a look at the biggest biosecurity concerns in the U.S. We chat with Dr. Stephanie Mercier with the Farm Journal Foundation about a report she authored analyzing the economic impact of some of the worst pest and disease threats farmers face. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at FieldForwardPod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And today on Farm Here Daily, we are going to take a look at biosecurity practices in the United States and some of the details that are going on in the latest research that we know about biosecurity. And to do so, we have joining us Dr. Stephanie Mercier with the Farm Journal Foundation, Senior Policy Advisor over at the Farm Journal Foundation. Dr. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today on Farm Here Daily. And let's talk about a paper that you guys have released recently, and specifically that you were working on and working with. First off, what is that paper about, and what are some of the details you found?
So this is a paper that was commissioned by Farm Journal Foundation, which we wanted to look at some of the major pest diseases and pathogens that pose a serious economic threat to U.S. agriculture. We dubbed it the Mean 16 because we thought it was a catchy phrase, frankly, but also we wanted to underline the fact that not only are the pests that we know about a major threat, but we also want to acknowledge that there is stuff that pops up every year that is a potential economic threat. So of the Mean 16, 4 of them are ones that are actually not a current threat to the United States because they haven't yet crossed the borders. And these are well-known, especially animal diseases like foot and mouth disease, which we have not had in the case of in the United States for nearly 100 years, and New World screwworm, which has gotten a lot of attention lately because of the stepped-up surveillance going on, because there have been cases detected in Mexico as close as 70 miles to the U.S.-Mexico border. Both of those would have huge economic impacts on the U.S. livestock sector if they were to reappear. The other ones in that category were soybean rust, which actually is in the United States, but not a major threat because so far it has not overwintered in the Midwest, which would allow it to have a much more deleterious effect on U.S. soybean production because that's where the bulk of the production is. The other 12 pests are ones that are already here, and we consulted with a number of different farm and commodity organizations to get their thinking on what are some of these pests, and most of them are ones for which there is no effective treatment available. There are, in the cases of the crops, there are fungicides and other kinds of herbicides that can help treat it, but those kinds of things keep coming back, especially the fungal diseases, because you tend to, if there's crop residue in the field after the harvest is over, then those spores can often overwinter in the crop debris and then be available to infect your crop the next year. So these are all major things. We looked at both row crop diseases like corn ear rot, which includes aflatoxin, which most Iowa farmers would be familiar with. Fortunately, they don't see it every year, but in hot, dry summers, it's often a problem in the Midwest. Soybean cyst nematode is included in the paper, and then things like citrus greening in the horticultural sector, and of course, highly pathogenic avian influenza, which we all know the impacts of that when we go to the grocery store and look to buy eggs.
When you talk about that, I immediately think of, highly pathogenic avian influenza. I think of a few years ago, PEDV, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. Some of these diseases that have flown through, devastated livestock, but there's also, as you mentioned, some big ones that have impacted crops. You said that there aren't really huge ways to treat them just yet. Is that kind of the basis of this study, of things that we know of that we don't have effective countermeasures against, so the only real treatment we have is prevention?
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of the criteria when I looked to create this list of Mean 16, is that these are pathogens or pests that we don't really have a handle on yet, and so they continue to reoccur. And so so, last part of the paper is a set of policy recommendations, and a lot of that focuses on where do we need to focus our research funding. And clearly, one of the areas is let's go to can we develop resistance to these pests and diseases in our plants and animals, and so that we don't the farmers don't have to spend literal billions of dollars on herbicides and pesticides to treat it in a way that is not even fully effective. So huge area of research is in developing that genetic resistance.
Could you break down the cost? Since you mentioned billions of dollars, what is that cost to farmers or to consumers that you found through the study?
Well, so not every one of the pests and diseases actually had a dollar amount associated with the damages because some of them are fairly recent. For example, there's a new pest hitting the rice crop in the United States, especially in Texas and Mississippi. That's so new that the economists at universities like Texas A&M and University of Arkansas are still working on developing estimates. But we do know in aggregate that invasive species as a whole cost the U.S. economy more than $120 billion a year. Not all of that is agriculture, but a big chunk of it is. So we know we're talking in the tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's not just a U.S. problem, it's a global problem.
Do we know the general cost it takes to implement and create biosecurity practices, whether it's at a federal level or on the farm?
Well, that's one of the things we recommend is that USDA set up a task force. Bring in the best scientists from the agencies, from the universities, bring in representatives of the farm and commodity groups, and let's set up a way of developing a strategy. And hopefully that task force can then also try to find a way to prioritize where the funding should go. But yeah, if we're spending already tens of billions of dollars to combat these things, then spending a smaller amount of that to avoid it, I think, would be a good investment.
Right, because the idea is, the ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. And that seems to be the case specifically in livestock. That's been a
Mm,
huge priority and focus, especially with things like avian influenza. I've noticed where, you get that and the whole barn has to be
yeah,
depopulated.
yeah. I
So,
mean, it's just devastating in terms of the economics, and frankly, I think it's an emotional blow to the producers for who is maybe not so much for poultry because they're not around quite as long, but when you're talking about hogs or cattle, farmers know them individually as animals, and if they have to then call the entire herd because of an outbreak, that's difficult for them emotionally as well.
does this study address it all? Speaking of that, with livestock in particular, they have such few risk management options in comparison to crops. Whereas when they do get a disease or virus that wipes out their herd or their flock, they really don't have ways to have compensation because of it. Do you guys have recommendations on how to help producers mitigate it from a livestock perspective?
Well, so USDA does have the authority to compensate farmers for when they have to call their herds. Uh, but one of the recommendations of the paper is for that the agencies with that authority to publish protocols or guidance so that producers have a better idea under what circumstances they would be entitled to some compensation. So that would sort of reduce some of the uncertainty going into these outbreaks. And there are within the federal crop insurance program there are programs there are policies for livestock, but those are mainly price based. But also within the farm bill there are programs that provide compensation for farmers who have higher morbidity or mortality rates among the herd than normal. They can get compensation for that as well. So there are some avenues for recourse, but probably not as well known as they should be.
How do you account for new viruses or pests? I noticed that there is a dishonorable mentions at the end of this study, And there have been some pretty recent pests that just will pop up, and we don't know necessarily where they come from. I think of a recent soybean pest that has popped up in the Midwest of I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but
Mm,
you might be familiar. They kind of infest the stem. I
mm,
can't think of the name immediately off the top of my head. They're very hard to deal with because they resist traditional pesticide methods because they go inside of the plant. And I've spoken to numerous researchers, and they're like, we don't know necessarily where this showed up, like how it
yeah,
showed up. And the best thought at the moment was simply they migrated from legumes pretty recently.
yeah. Well,
How do we account for mitigation of new pests?
and that's the first section of the policy recommendation piece is trying to bolster international cooperation. It is to make sure that we have friendly relationship with countries where some of these pests might appear long before they ever show up in the United States. And so if we have good relationships and this should be not just a bilateral set of relationship, but it should be an international cooperation multilaterally, so that we get advance warning and in some cases can even help those countries combat it, which would reduce the likelihood that it would cross the border and come here. I mean, you can't ever stop it, but you can certainly help provide some advance warning and get our farmers ready for it. I mean, like something like 2004, 2005, I had the honor to meet Norman Borlaug when I was on the staff of the Senate Ag Committee. He was in his 90s at the time. He died in 2009, I believe. And he was there because he wanted to make sure people knew there was a new strain of wheat stem rust that was causing real problems in Asia called the UG99. And he succeeded in his goal because he sort of got the research community up and going and researching this. And we're fortunate in that time since that meeting I had with him, 20 some years ago, that particular strain of wheat stem rust has never appeared in the United States, but we have the science ready to combat it if it does. So that's the kind of thing that we need to have more advanced warning, more cooperation to be ready for this stuff.
By the way, I did do a quick glance and triggered my memory. It's soybean gallmage. That was what I
Okay.
was referring to. I forgot the name. Sometimes it's in my head. I
Yeah.
just can't remember it.
I don't think that one is actually on the list of dishonorable
Right.
mentions.
Yeah. Yeah.
The list of dishonorable mentions, I went out and reached out to the corn growers, soybean associates, wheat growers, etc., and they would provide me with a list of several candidates, and I would pick one or more for the mean 16 list, but then the rest of them I put on the dishonorable mention list. And so it wasn't a systematic process, but it was just a recognition that this problem is far more widespread than just the 16 that we discussed in some detail.
Understanding that, it makes it seem as well then that the study and what you are looking at here is designed to raise awareness
Yeah.
for the need to both invest and uplift research when it comes to diseases and pests. Is that correct?
I think that's exactly what we're trying to achieve is farmers know that these are a problem. It's the non-farmers who don't. And so it was not an accident that we released this paper in an event in the House Agriculture committee room last week. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get the attendance that we had hoped because there was a series of votes on the National Defense Authorization Act that went into the evening, and so we missed out on getting some of the staff and members to appear at the event. But we've gotten a lot, and like we've gotten a lot of attention to this paper from the ag media, and we're hoping that we can sort of cross that barrier and make it into the general media and start to raise awareness that way.
So you understand this research is important. I understand this research is important. Let's break it down from a both as a farmer who'd like to communicate to their neighbors and also just a non-farmer who may be listening. Why is it important to make sure this research is funded? I mean, let's take a full devil's advocate position, right? Most of these diseases aren't just wiping out the crop. It's an efficiency loss. There's a percentage loss. It's not like we're losing all of our food. They're just a little bit of loss here and there. Once again, devil advocate, not my actual
Yeah, yeah,
personal
no, I
position.
understand.
But why should we spend public dollars? Why should we spend that? What would be the argument to make that you find persuasive for folks who don't understand agriculture?
Well, I mean, even if for example, an outbreak of aflatoxin doesn't wipe out the entire Midwest corn crop, it won't, but it could still have a serious impact on it. And if you have less corn available, then uh, cost of livestock feed will go up, cost of meat will go up, and that inflation that is pestering everybody when they go to the grocery store will continue. Or another piece of the paper is we actually looked at 3 outbreaks of diseases that are not affecting U.S. crops, but affect stuff that we import and enjoy, like coffee, for example. There's a real problem in Central America called the coffee leaf rust, or it's roya in Spanish, that has reduced the coffee crop in that part of the world, Guatemala, Costa Rica, those countries, and has contributed to the higher coffee prices that our consumers are facing. Same with bananas, same with chocolate, cocoa are also crops grown overseas that have an impact on the prices of consumer goods that Americans enjoy. So yeah, it's going to impact consumers. They may not know that's the reason, but it's going to contribute to that inflation that has everybody concerned.
It's a bit of a trickle down effect through the supply chain, and at the end of the day, those prices that raise tend to be placed on the consumer as opposed to any of the middlemen.
Yep, yep. Well, I mean, those price increases are not going to be eaten by Hershey or Starbucks. So the consumer is going to see it in their wallet.
As a final wrap up, final question, what is the big takeaway? Aside from the communication point that we just mentioned, what would you hope folks take away from looking at a study like this and walk away from when they look at biosecurity moving forward?
Well, we had a session on this paper. It was kind of a prequel or preview at an event called the Sustainable Agriculture Summit that was held in California in late November. And one of the participants in the panel was one of our farmer ambassadors for the foundation, named A.G. Kalmura, who used to be Secretary of Agriculture in the state when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor. And A.G. talked about the fact that the general public can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. And A.G. talked about a woman walking into the airport from, say, Mexico with a pork sandwich. And she does not know that she's potentially carrying a $1 billion problem for the U.S. pork industry. And I've done some international travel over the years, not recently, and I am quite aware that the average American does not take the quarantine rules when they re-enter the United States from overseas very seriously. And I think part of the education process we need to do is make sure that the average American understands that they actually have a role to play here.
Dr. Stephanie Mercier is with the Farm Journal Foundation. She is a senior policy advisor over there. Dr. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on Farm Your Daily.
My pleasure, David.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I hope you all have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday, everybody.